crumbling gates of the abandoned Hartley mansion, Sarah, a young single mother barely scraping by, clutching a deed that had cost her just $1, stood before the mansion. With her 5-year-old daughter Emma waiting in their packed car and their savings drained, this derelict 1,980 seconds estate was her final desperate gamble. The windows were dark, hollow eyes staring back from beneath collapsed eaves, and the grand entrance was choked with 15 years of neglect. She had been warned by the county clerk, cautioned by neighbors who refused to speak of the place, but desperation drowns out whispers when you have a child to protect. As she pushed open the rotting front door, her breath caught. Inside was not the decay she expected, but something that had been waiting in the darkness for someone brave enough to find it. What had the previous owners left behind that made an entire town go silent? What secret would change everything Sarah thought she knew about survival? The air in the Flathead County Courthouse was thick with the scent of old wood polish, stale coffee, and the nervous energy of people chasing bargains. Sarah Mitchell sat on a hard wooden bench near the back of the auction room. Her 5-year-old daughter Emma nestled quietly against her side, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Sarah was a young woman in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and tired blue eyes that had learned to mask desperation behind a veneer of calm determination. She wore her best outfit, which was really just her cleanest jeans and a simple gray sweater, and her hands, calloused from years of waitressing double shifts at the Mountain View Diner, gripped the crumpled property listing she had torn from the county bulletin board 3 weeks ago. The room was filled with real estate speculators in expensive jackets, developers with leather portfolios, and investors who spoke in hushed tones about flipping properties and profit margins. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a droning voice, worked methodically through the list of foreclosed properties and tax-delinquent land parcels. Sarah had sat through 40 minutes of rapid-fire bidding, watching hands shoot up with aggressive confidence, listening to prices climb from thousands to tens of thousands in mere seconds. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, his tone shifting to something flatter, more perfunctory. Next item, Parcel 14C, known locally as the Hartley Mansion, he announced, and the room underwent a transformation that made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. The low hum of conversation ceased abruptly, replaced by a profound, heavy silence that felt almost physical. It was not the anticipatory quiet before a competitive bidding war, but something else entirely, something that tasted of fear and old secrets. Property consists of one main residence, approximately 6,000 square feet, built 1984, condition listed as severely deteriorated, plus 12 acres of land, one detached greenhouse structure, condition unknown. The auctioneer continued, his words seeming to echo in the unnatural stillness. This property comes to the county by way of 15 years unpaid property taxes. Sold as is, where is, with no warranties or guarantees of any kind, will open bidding at $500. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward the front, but not a single hand moved. The speculators who had been so eager moments before now sat with their arms crossed, their faces carefully neutral. The auctioneer waited, his expression betraying a flicker of resignation, as if he had expected this exact response. Do I hear 500? Silence. How about 100? More silence. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She had $372 left in her checking account after paying for Emma's doctor visit last week. Her landlord had given her until the end of the month to come up with 2 months' back rent or face eviction. This was insanity, but it was also the only chance she had left. With a trembling hand, feeling the weight of her daughter pressed against her side and the crushing pressure of their circumstances, Sarah raised her hand. $1, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. The auctioneer's eyes found her, and for just a moment, she saw something in his expression that looked like pity. I have $1 from the young lady in the back, he said quietly. Do I hear 2? The silence stretched. No one moved. No one spoke. The speculators stared at her with expressions that made her blood run cold, a mixture of pity, fear, and something that looked disturbingly like they were watching someone walk voluntarily toward a cliff's edge. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, sold to the young lady for $1. As Sarah stood on shaking legs, clutching Emma's small hand and moving toward the front to complete the paperwork, whispers erupted behind her like a rising tide. She caught fragments of sentences that followed her like ghosts. Poor thing, She doesn't know, and that place has been cursed since Catherine vanished, and most chilling of all, she doesn't know what she's bought. The sign above the weathered storefront read Patterson's General Store in faded red letters, and the bell above the door chimed a cheerful note that seemed incongruous with the heavy silence that had followed Sarah out of the courthouse. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, coffee beans, and the musty scent of old wood that seemed to permeate every building in this small Montana town. The shelves were stocked with an eclectic mix of camping supplies, canned goods, work gloves, and locally made preserves. The kind of place that served as both hardware store and grocer for a community too small to support specialized shops. Behind the counter stood an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in these mountains, his white hair neatly combed and his flannel shirt pressed with the care of someone from a generation that believed in maintaining standards even in isolated places. Sarah approached with Emma holding her hand, setting a shopping basket on the counter filled with basic supplies, cleaning products, light bulbs, a few canned goods, and a small toy for Emma that had been the cheapest thing she could find. "Afternoon," the shopkeeper said, his voice warm and gravelly. "I'm John Patterson. I don't believe I've seen you folks around here before." Sarah offered a tired smile, pulling out her carefully counted bills. "We're new. Just bought a property at the county auction this morning. The Hartley place." The change in Mr. Patterson's demeanor was instant and dramatic. The friendly warmth drained from his face, replaced by a pallor that made him look suddenly much older, and his hand, which had been reaching for her money, froze in midair. He stared at her for a long moment, his rimy blue eyes moving from her face to Emma's, and something that looked disturbingly like grief crossed his features. "The Hartley mansion," he said quietly, and it was not a question but a statement weighted with 15 years of unspoken history. "Ma'am, I don't mean to pry into your business, but did anyone at that auction tell you about that property?" Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, the same unease she had felt in the courthouse magnified by the genuine concern in this stranger's voice. "Only that it had been abandoned for a long time due to unpaid taxes," she replied carefully. Mr. Patterson sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the burden of secrets kept too long. He glanced around the empty store, then leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping low as if the walls themselves might be listening. "That house belonged to Catherine Hartley, a brilliant woman, an environmental scientist from back east who came here in the early 1982s to study the mountain watershed. She was respected, well-liked, kept to herself mostly, but was always kind to folks in town. Then around 2006, 2007, she started asking questions about the water quality, about why so many people in the downstream communities were getting sick. She began making accusations against Meridian Chemical Corporation, claimed they were dumping industrial waste into the aquifer, poisoning entire towns." He paused, his gnarled hands gripping the counter's edge as if steadying himself against the weight of the story. "In March of 2008, Catherine Hartley vanished. Her car was found abandoned at a hiking trailhead up on Copper Ridge, but they never found her body. The official report said accidental death, that she must have fallen or gotten lost in the wilderness, but nobody with half a brain believed it. She was an experienced hiker who knew these mountains better than most, and she disappeared the day before she was supposed to meet with federal environmental investigators. After that, the property got tangled up in all kinds of legal disputes, with the county, with her family back east, with lawyers representing interests that nobody wanted to name out loud. 15 years it sat there, and in all that time, not a single person has been willing to touch it. Until today." Sarah felt Emma's hand tighten in hers, the little girl sensing her mother's tension, even if she couldn't understand the words. "Mr. Patterson's eyes were kind but filled with a sad certainty when he looked at her again. "I don't know what circumstances brought you to that auction house, and I'm not judging. But that property, that house, it's got a history that powerful people want to keep buried. Some doors, ma'am, are better left closed. For your sake and for that little girl's sake, you might want to consider walking away from this before you get in too deep." The drive from Patterson's General Store to the Hartley property took 20 minutes along increasingly rough roads, each turn taking them deeper into the wilderness and farther from the comfort of civilization. Sarah's old pickup truck, a 2005 Ford that had seen better days and burned oil with alarming regularity, groaned and rattled over potholes and washboard sections of gravel that eventually gave way to little more than 2 dirt ruts carved through dense forest. The trees pressed in on both sides, towering pines and Douglas firs that blocked out much of the afternoon sun, casting the road in a perpetual twilight that made Emma scoot closer to her mother in the truck's bench seat. They found the entrance marked only by 2 stone pillars, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen, the iron gates that had once hung between them long since rusted away and collapsed into the undergrowth. The driveway beyond was barely passable, choked with wild grasses, saplings that had taken root in the gravel, and the skeletal remains of ornamental shrubs that had grown into twisted, untamed monsters. Sarah drove slowly, her truck suspension protesting with every bump, until the trees opened into a clearing, and the Hartley mansion revealed itself like a ghost emerging from fog. The house was a striking example of 1982's modernist architecture, all clean geometric lines and bold angular forms that must have been considered cutting-edge when Catherine Hartley built it. The structure was 2 stories of dark wood and stone, with massive floor-to-ceiling windows that ran along the entire front face, their glass now clouded with grime and spiderwebs, but still hinting at the breathtaking mountain views they had once framed. The roof was flat with dramatic overhangs, and the entrance was marked by a wide concrete porch supported by thick timber posts. Attached to the east side of the main house was a large greenhouse, its aluminum frame still intact, but its glass panels either shattered or obscured by the wild vines that had consumed it, transforming it into something that looked less like a structure and more like an organic cocoon of green. The whole property had the haunting quality of a place where time had stopped violently and suddenly, as if its owner had simply vanished mid-sentence, leaving her home to the slow, patient reclamation of the wilderness. Sarah killed the engine, and for a moment, she and Emma sat in silence, taking in what was now their home. "Mama, it looks like a castle where a princess used to live," Emma whispered, clutching her worn, stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy, tighter against her chest, her wide brown eyes drinking in the strange, sad grandeur of the abandoned mansion. Sarah felt tears threatening at the edges of her vision, a combination of exhaustion, fear, and the weight of Mr. Patterson's warnings, but she forced them back and managed to smile for her daughter. "It needs some work, baby, but we're going to make it beautiful again," she said with more confidence than she felt. They climbed out of the truck, and the mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and the faint, earthy smell of decay. Sarah grabbed 2 bags of their essential supplies while Emma held tight to Mr. Hoppy with one hand and her mother's jacket with the other. The porch steps were solid despite their weathered appearance, and the boards, though covered in fallen pine needles and years of grime, did not give way under their weight. It was when they reached the front door that Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold, and her investigative instincts, dormant after years of just trying to survive, suddenly flare to life. The door itself was original to the house, a heavy slab of oak with a small window of frosted glass, its surface weathered and cracked from 15 Montana winters. But the lock, the deadbolt mechanism that secured it, was different. It was new, modern, the brass still bright and unvarnished, recently installed with fresh screws that showed no signs of rust or age. Someone had been here, not 15 years ago when Catherine Hartley vanished, but recently, perhaps within the last few months, and they had taken the time to secure this supposedly abandoned house with a brand new lock. The drive from Patterson's general store to the Hartley property took 20 minutes along increasingly rough roads, each turn taking them deeper into the wilderness and farther from the comfort of civilization. Sarah's old pickup truck, a 2005 Ford that had seen better days, groaned and rattled over potholes and washboard sections of gravel that eventually gave way to little more than 2 dirt ruts carved through dense forest. The trees pressed in on both sides, towering pines and Douglas firs that blocked out much of the afternoon sun, casting the narrow road in a perpetual twilight that made Emma scoot closer to her mother in the truck's bench seat, her small fingers clutching the worn, stuffed rabbit she had named Mr. Hoppy. They found the entrance marked only by 2 stone pillars, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen, the iron gates that had once hung between them long since rusted away and collapsed into the undergrowth. The driveway beyond was barely passable, choked with wild grasses that brushed against the truck's undercarriage and saplings that had taken root in what had once been carefully maintained gravel. Sarah drove slowly, her vehicle's suspension protesting with every bump, until the trees opened suddenly into a clearing and the Hartley mansion revealed itself like a ghost emerging from mountain fog. The house was a striking example of 1982's modernist architecture, all clean geometric lines and bold angular forms that must have been considered cutting-edge and revolutionary when Catherine Hartley built it. The structure was 2 stories of dark cedar wood and native stone, with massive floor-to-ceiling windows that ran along the entire front face, their glass now clouded with years of grime and intricate spiderwebs, but still hinting at the breathtaking mountain views they had once framed. The roof was flat with dramatic overhangs designed to shed heavy snow, and the entrance was marked by a wide porch of weathered concrete supported by thick timber posts. Attached to the east side of the main house was a large greenhouse, its aluminum frame still structurally intact but its glass panels either shattered or completely obscured by the wild vines that had consumed it, transforming the structure into something that looked less like architecture and more like an organic cocoon of tangled green. The whole property had the haunting quality of a place where time had stopped violently and suddenly, as if its owner had simply vanished mid-sentence, leaving her home to the slow, patient reclamation of the wilderness. Sarah killed the engine, and for a moment, she and Emma sat in heavy silence, taking in what was now their home, their future, their desperate last chance. "Mama, it looks like a castle where a princess used to live," Emma whispered, her wide brown eyes drinking in the strange, melancholic grandeur of the abandoned mansion. But the princess went away and never came back. Sarah felt tears threatening at the edges of her vision, but she forced them back and managed a smile for her daughter. They climbed out of the truck into air that was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and the faint earthy smell of decay. The porch steps were solid despite their weathered appearance, and the boards, though covered in fallen needles and years of accumulated grime, did not give way under their weight. It was when they reached the front door that Sarah noticed something that made her investigative instincts, dormant after years of just trying to survive, suddenly flare to life with cold alarm. The door itself was original, a heavy slab of oak with a small window of frosted glass, its surface weathered and cracked from 15 Montana winters. But the lock, the heavy deadbolt mechanism that secured it, was different. It was new, modern, the brass still bright and unvarnished, recently installed with fresh screws that showed no signs of rust or weathering. Someone had been here, not 15 years ago, when Catherine Hartley vanished, but recently, perhaps within the last few months, and they had taken the time to secure this supposedly abandoned house with a brand new lock. The key from the county clerk's office turned smoothly in the new lock, which only deepened Sarah's unease, and the heavy oak door swung inward with a long, protesting groan that echoed through the empty interior like the sigh of something that had been holding its breath for 15 years. The air that rushed out to meet them was stale and thick with dust, carrying the musty scent of abandonment. But underneath it was something else, something faintly chemical that Sarah couldn't quite identify. She reached around the doorframe, half expecting the electricity to be long dead, but when she flipped the switch, overhead lights flickered to life, casting a warm yellow glow across a scene that felt like stepping directly into a photograph from 1985. The main living space was vast and open, with that signature 1980 seconds commitment to dramatic interior volumes, and it was filled with furniture that Catherine Hartley had left behind, as if she had simply stepped out for an afternoon hike and never returned. Low-slung geometric sofas in muted earth tones sat beneath white dust sheets that had turned gray with time. Angular chrome and glass coffee tables reflected the overhead lights, and the far wall was dominated by a massive fireplace constructed from river stones that stretched from floor to ceiling, its hearth cold and filled with ancient ash. The walls were lined with built-in bookshelves made of dark wood, and they were filled, absolutely crammed, with scientific journals, technical manuals, leather-bound field notebooks, and reference books about hydrology, geology, and environmental science, the library of a serious and dedicated researcher. Sarah spent the next 3 hours in a frenzy of cleaning, attacking the dust and grime with a desperation that was about more than just hygiene. It was about claiming this space, about making it theirs, about transforming this haunted time capsule into something that resembled a home. She found a small bedroom on the second floor that must have been a guest room, its window facing east toward the mountain peaks, and she scrubbed it clean while Emma helped by organizing her few toys in a corner and arranging Mr. Hoppy on the windowsill, where he could watch for bears. They ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the electric stove that miraculously still worked. And as the mountain darkness fell outside those massive windows, transforming them into black mirrors that reflected the interior back at them, Sarah inflated 2 air mattresses she had bought at a discount store and made beds with the clean sheets she had packed. Emma fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's overwhelming changes. Her small body curled around Mr. Hoppy, her breathing soft, and even in the unfamiliar silence of the mansion. Sarah lay awake on her own air mattress beside her daughter, staring at the dark ceiling, her mind racing through all the warnings, all the strangeness, all the questions about that new lock, when she heard it clearly and distinctly cutting through the mountain silence. Footsteps on gravel, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots moving around the perimeter of the house. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, and she slipped quietly out of her makeshift bed, moving to the window with the careful silence of someone who had spent years walking through apartments late at night trying not to wake a sleeping child. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window frame and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain just enough to peer out into the darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing but the black shapes of trees against the slightly lighter black of the night sky, and then it appeared, a brief flash of white light. A flashlight beam sweeping methodically across the overgrown yard, illuminating the greenhouse, the truck, the edge of the porch, before clicking off and disappearing back into the impenetrable darkness of the surrounding forest, leaving Sarah trembling in the cold room with the terrible certainty that someone knew they were here, someone was watching, and their arrival had not gone unnoticed. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows, transforming the mansion from the haunted shell of the previous night into something that felt almost hopeful in the clear mountain light. And Sarah decided that fear and paranoia would not rule their lives here, that they would explore their new home thoroughly and claim every corner of it. Emma, resilient in the way only 5-year-olds can be, had already forgotten her nervousness from the night before and appointed herself the official explorer, running from room to room with Mr. Hoppy tucked under her arm, announcing her discoveries with the serious authority of a small expedition leader. The second floor had 5 rooms opening off a central hallway, 3 bedrooms, a bathroom with fixtures that screamed 1,980 seconds excess, and 1 door at the very end of the corridor that Emma discovered would not open no matter how hard she pushed. "Mama, this one is stuck," she called out, and Sarah came down the hallway to investigate, expecting to find a door swollen shut from years of moisture or perhaps just a stubborn latch. What she found instead made her breath catch in her throat. Unlike every other door in the house, which had simple brass knobs and standard privacy locks, this door was secured with a heavy-duty padlock, the kind you would use on a storage unit or a gate. Its hardened steel shackle looped through a hasp that had been screwed directly into both the door and the frame. The padlock was new, matching the newness of the front door's deadbolt, its surface unmarred by rust or weather, and someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure that whatever was behind this door stayed hidden and secure. Sarah felt Mr. Patterson's words echo in her mind, his warning about legal disputes and powerful people wanting things kept buried, and she knew with absolute certainty that this room contained something important, something that explained why a supposedly abandoned house had brand new security. She told Emma to go play in her room, that Mama needed to do some grown-up work, and then she made her way down to the detached garage, a simple wooden structure that housed an old workbench and a surprising array of well-maintained tools. She found a heavy-duty bolt cutter hanging on a pegboard, its handles still wrapped in the original rubber grips, and she carried it back upstairs with a sense of purpose that felt almost ceremonial. The bolt cutter's jaws bit into the hardened steel shackle with a satisfying resistance, and it took all of Sarah's strength, her arms shaking with effort, to squeeze the handles together until the metal finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the hallway. She removed the broken padlock, turned the handle, and pushed the door open into a room that had been perfectly preserved, hermetically sealed away from the decay that had touched the rest of the house. It was Catherine Hartley's home office, and it was the workspace of someone who had been conducting a serious, urgent, and dangerous investigation. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with neat stacks of folders, a typewriter that looked like a museum piece, and several spiral-bound notebooks filled with dense handwritten notes. Against one wall stood 2 tall filing cabinets, their drawers slightly open as if someone had been in the middle of retrieving documents. But it was the walls themselves that made Sarah's heart begin to race, because every available surface was covered with maps of the local area marked with colored pins and circles, photographs of industrial facilities and water testing sites, newspaper clippings about cancer clusters in downstream communities, and pages upon pages of handwritten notes connected by red string in the classic style of an investigator tracking a conspiracy, creating a web of evidence that pointed to a single, terrible conclusion that someone had been willing to kill to suppress. Sarah spent the entire day in that locked room, sitting at Catherine Hartley's desk with Emma playing quietly in the hallway outside, reading through files that grew progressively more horrifying with each page she turned. Catherine had been a hydrogeologist with impressive credentials, a PhD from MIT and 15 years of field experience studying freshwater systems, and she had come to Montana in 1982 to conduct what was supposed to be a routine 3-year study of the mountain watershed for the United States Geological Survey. Her early notebooks were filled with the meticulous observations of a dedicated scientist, measurements of stream flow rates, seasonal variation in spring outputs, detailed maps of the underground aquifer system that fed the entire valley, and careful documentation of the pristine water quality that made this region an ecological treasure. Then, in 1985, Meridian Chemical Corporation had built their processing plant 15 miles upstream, a massive facility that produced industrial solvents and chemical intermediates used in manufacturing. And Catherine's notebooks began to change. The entries became concerned, then alarmed, then filled with a controlled fury that radiated from every precisely written word. She had documented a pattern that was undeniable. In the 3 small towns that drew their drinking water from wells tapping into the aquifer downstream of the Meridian plant, cancer rates had begun to climb within 2 years of the facility's opening. By 1990, the incidence of certain rare cancers, particularly childhood leukemia and liver cancer in adults, was triple the national average, and by 2000, it was 5 times higher. A statistical anomaly so severe that it screamed causation rather than coincidence. Catherine had not stopped at correlation. She had conducted her own water sampling, collecting hundreds of specimens from private wells, public water supplies, and direct aquifer access points. And her laboratory analysis revealed a toxic cocktail of industrial chemicals, trichloroethylene, benzene, vinyl chloride, and a dozen other compounds that were known carcinogens, present in concentrations that were orders of magnitude above EPA safety standards. But the most damning evidence was contained in a thick folder labeled Internal Documents that Catherine had somehow obtained, and Sarah's hands trembled as she read through the photocopied memos and reports. These were internal Meridian communications, stamped confidential and proprietary, that showed the company's own environmental engineers had identified serious problems with their waste disposal system as early as 1986. The facility's underground storage tanks were leaking, their containment barriers had failed, and millions of gallons of untreated chemical waste were seeping directly into the fractured bedrock that formed the aquifer, creating a slow-moving underground river of poison that was flowing inexorably toward the populated valleys below. The engineers had recommended immediate repairs estimated to cost $12 million, but senior management had rejected the proposal, and a memo from the company's vice president of operations, dated April 1987, was shockingly explicit in its calculation. The cost of fixing the problem exceeded the projected cost of potential lawsuits by a factor of 3. And the legal department's opinion was that establishing definitive causation between facility operations and health outcomes would be difficult and time-consuming, providing ample opportunity for strategic delay and settlement negotiations that would minimize financial exposure. They had known, Catherine's notes concluded in angry capital letters, they had known from the very beginning that they were poisoning entire communities, and they had made a conscious, calculated decision that it was cheaper to let people die than to fix their facility, and they had spent the next 20 years falsifying environmental impact reports, bribing local officials to look the other way, and using their political connections to ensure that state and federal regulators never looked too closely at their operations in this remote corner of Montana. Sarah was still in Catherine's office, photographing pages of the internal memos with her phone's camera, when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching up the long driveway, its engine a smooth, expensive purr that was nothing like her truck's laboring rattle. She moved quickly to the window and watched as a sleek black Mercedes sedan, its paint job gleaming like polished obsidian, pulled to a stop beside her battered pickup, the contrast between the two vehicles a stark illustration of the chasm between their worlds. The man who emerged was in his early 50s, tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sarah had earned in 6 months at the diner. his silver hair styled with professional precision, and his shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty driveway. He moved with the confident, unhurried grace of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and anger as she watched him approach the front porch. She met him at the door before he could knock, stepping outside and pulling it closed behind her, keeping herself between this stranger and her daughter who was inside watching cartoons on an old portable DVD player. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, offering a hand with a smile that showed perfect white teeth. "My name is Donald Vance. I'm an attorney representing Meridian Chemical Corporation. You must be Sarah Mitchell, the new owner of this property. Congratulations on your purchase." Sarah did not take his offered hand, and after a moment of awkward suspension, Vance withdrew it without any visible change in his pleasant expression. "I won't take much of your time," he continued, pulling a slim leather briefcase from under his arm, "but my clients have asked me to reach out to you regarding a business proposition. Meridian Chemical has been attempting to acquire this property for many years as part of a regional land consolidation effort, and we've been quite frustrated by the legal complications surrounding the estate. Now that those issues have been resolved through the tax auction, we'd very much like to purchase the land from you. We're prepared to offer $50,000, cash, transferred to your account within 48 hours of signed agreement." The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was more money than she had ever imagined possessing. 10 times her annual salary from the diner, enough to give Emma a stable childhood, to pay for college someday, to finally stop living on the razor's edge of financial disaster. For a moment, she felt the almost overwhelming temptation to simply say yes, to take the money and walk away from this decaying mansion and whatever dangerous secrets it held. But then she thought of Catherine Hartley's meticulous documentation of the families dying in those downstream towns, of the casual corporate memo that had calculated their lives as an acceptable cost of doing business, and she heard herself say, "I need some time to think about it." Vance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and something cold flickered behind his professionally friendly eyes. "Of course it's a significant decision," he said, his tone remaining pleasant but acquiring an edge that made Sarah's skin prickle with warning. "Though I should mention that my clients are quite eager to resolve this matter quickly. This property has been a source of concern for them for many years, and they're very motivated to see it handled properly." He paused, letting his gaze drift past her to the front door, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle, which somehow made his words even more threatening. "I understand you have a daughter, Emma, is it? 5 years old? It must be difficult, being a single mother, so vulnerable and alone out here in such an isolated location. These mountains can be dangerous, especially for people who aren't familiar with them. I'd hate to see anything unfortunate happen to you or your little girl." The morning after Donald Vance's visit, Sarah drove into town with a determination that was fueled by equal parts fear and anger, leaving Emma with the only person she had begun to trust, Mr. Patterson, who had agreed to let the little girl help him stock shelves at the general store. The local library was a small brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between a feed store and a long-closed diner, its interior cool and quiet with that particular library smell of old paper and furniture polish. Behind the reference desk sat a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a nameplate that identified her as Margaret Chen, local history librarian. Sarah approached with what she hoped was a casual smile and asked if there were any historical records or newspaper archives about the Hartley property, and she watched Margaret's friendly expression shift through a rapid sequence of emotions: recognition, concern, fear, and finally, a kind of resigned sadness. "You're the one who bought the place," Margaret said quietly, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, because in a town this small, everyone knew everything within hours. "Come with me. We should talk somewhere more private." She led Sarah to a small study room in the back of the library, closing the door behind them and glancing nervously through the small window, as if checking to make sure they were truly alone. "I worked with Catherine," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands fidgeting with the beaded chain of her glasses. "Not professionally, I mean, but we were friends. Part of the same book club, and she used to come here to use the microfiche machine when she was researching old land records and newspaper articles about Meridian Chemical. She was brilliant and kind and absolutely certain that she was going to expose what they were doing, that she was going to save those families downstream who were getting sick. Margaret paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears that spoke of 15 years of carrying a terrible knowledge. On March 14, 2008, Catherine's car was found abandoned at the Copper Ridge trailhead, about 10 miles east of her property. The keys were still in the ignition. Her hiking pack was gone, but her wallet and phone were left on the front seat. The sheriff organized a search that lasted 5 days, and they found nothing. No sign of her on any of the trails, no evidence that she had ever left her vehicle. The official report concluded accidental death, presumed fall or exposure, but nobody who knew Catherine believed that for a second. She had been hiking those mountains for 20 years. She was experienced and careful, and she would never have gone out without telling someone her route. Margaret glanced toward the door again, then reached into the folder she had been carrying and slid a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table, her finger pointing to a date circled in red ink. The article was from the Valley Sentinel, dated March 15, 2008, with the headline, "Local Scientist Missing on Copper Ridge," and buried in the third paragraph was a detail that made Sarah's blood run cold. Catherine Hartley had been scheduled to meet with investigators from the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Enforcement Division on March 15 to present evidence of illegal dumping and environmental crimes, and she had vanished less than 24 hours before that meeting was to take place. The EPA investigators came anyway, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. They stayed for 3 days, asking questions, but without Catherine and without access to her research, they had nothing concrete to investigate. The case was closed, the facility was never inspected, and everyone in this town who knew the truth learned a very clear lesson about what happens when you challenge powerful people. That afternoon, back at the mansion, Sarah was making sandwiches in the kitchen when she heard Emma's excited voice calling from somewhere outside, and she looked through the window to see her daughter standing at the edge of the overgrown garden, pointing at something on the ground with the thrilled determination of a child who had discovered buried treasure. Sarah went out to find Emma had uncovered a stone pathway, its flat river rock still visible beneath years of accumulated pine needles and moss, leading like a secret trail through the wild tangle of what had once been carefully maintained flower beds toward the greenhouse structure attached to the east side of the house. "Mama, look. It's like a fairy path," Emma exclaimed, already following the stones with Mr. Hoppy tucked under her arm, and Sarah had no choice but to follow, pushing through overgrown shrubs and ducking under low-hanging branches until they reached the greenhouse entrance. The structure was larger than it had appeared from a distance, roughly 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, its aluminum frame still remarkably intact despite 15 years of neglect, though many of its glass panels had shattered or been pushed out by the aggressive vines that had invaded every corner. Inside, the air was thick and humid, filled with the earthy smell of decomposition and the wild, untamed green of plants that had long since escaped their original containers and colonized every available surface. The main space had once been a proper botanical greenhouse, with raised beds and hanging planters, but at the far end, separated by a half-wall of glass blocks, was a smaller room that made Sarah's heart begin to race with the recognition of what she was seeing. It was a laboratory, crude but functional, with a sturdy workbench made of metal and stone that had resisted the worst of the decay. And on its surface sat an array of scientific equipment protected by a heavy tarp that Emma had partially pulled aside in her curious exploration. A microscope in a waterproof case, several pieces of glassware, a portable pH meter, and most significantly, what looked like a small spectrophotometer, the kind of device used for chemical analysis of water samples. Sarah approached the workbench with trembling hands, her mind racing with the implications, because this was not just a hobby greenhouse where Catherine Hartley had grown tomatoes and herbs. This was a covert laboratory where she had been conducting her own independent testing, bypassing any possibility of interference or falsification by corrupt officials. The workbench had 3 drawers, and Sarah opened them one by one. The first contained notebooks with detailed testing protocols and chemical analysis procedures. The second held various tools and supplies. And the third, the bottom drawer, was lined with oilcloth and contained something that made Sarah gasp aloud. Nestled in careful rows were dozens of small glass vials, each one sealed with a rubber stopper and wrapped in protective padding, and each one bore a small label written in Catherine's precise handwriting that listed a date, a location described by GPS coordinates, and a set of numbers that represented chemical concentrations. Sarah lifted one vial carefully and read its label in the dim light filtering through the vine-covered glass. Sample 47, the 3rd of March 2008, Harper Creek Residential Well. TCE 890 parts per billion, benzene 340 parts per billion, vinyl chloride 520 parts per billion, and she knew enough from her reading of Catherine's research to understand that these numbers represented contamination levels that were catastrophically above safe drinking water standards, that ppb meant parts per billion, and that even single-digit concentrations of these chemicals were considered dangerous. These vials were physical evidence, tangible proof that could not be dismissed or explained away, the smoking gun that Catherine had been preparing to hand to the EPA investigators on March 15, 2008, the evidence that had died with her, hidden away in this forgotten greenhouse for 15 years, waiting for someone to find it and finish what Catherine Hartley had started. The harassment began exactly 3 days after Donald Vance's visit, arriving with the mechanical precision of a well-orchestrated campaign, and it started with a knock on the door at 8 in the morning from a man who introduced himself as Gerald Mackey, Flathead County Building Inspector. He was a thin, nervous man in his 40s who would not meet Sarah's eyes as he handed her an official notice citing a complaint about the structural integrity of the property, though he became evasive when she asked who had filed the complaint, muttering something about anonymous concerned citizen reports. He spent 2 hours walking through the mansion with a clipboard, documenting every crack in the plaster, every warped floorboard, every window that did not seal perfectly, and when he finally left, he handed Sarah a citation that listed 47 code violations requiring immediate remediation with an estimated repair cost of $35,000 and a compliance deadline of 30 days. The next morning, a white van from the county health department arrived, and a woman with a severe expression and official credentials informed Sarah that there had been complaints about the property's septic system potentially contaminating groundwater, and she needed to conduct an immediate inspection. Sarah watched in growing disbelief as the inspector spent an hour poking around the property with testing equipment before declaring that the septic tank was non-compliant with current regulations and needed to be completely replaced at a cost of at least $12,000, with work to be completed within 45 days, or the property would be deemed uninhabitable and Sarah would face daily fines. The pattern continued with relentless, crushing efficiency. The fire marshal arrived on day 3, citing the mansion as a fire hazard due to outdated wiring and lack of proper smoke detection systems, issuing fines totaling $8,000 with a 2-week compliance window. The county water quality inspector came on day 4, claiming that the well water needed extensive testing and filtration systems, despite the fact that Sarah had been drinking it for a week without any problems, and on day 5, she received a certified letter from the county attorney's office informing her that she was in violation of local ordinances regarding property maintenance and vegetation management, with daily fines of $500 beginning immediately until the eyesore conditions were remediated. Sarah sat at Catherine Hartley's desk that evening, surrounded by the mounting pile of citations and fines, and she pulled out one of Catherine's journals from 2007, flipping to the section she had read days before with growing horror but not fully understanding until now. Catherine had documented the exact same campaign. The building inspector who had suddenly discovered problems with her foundation, the health department's concerns about her well water, the fire marshal's citation about her wood stove, the endless cascade of official complaints and fines that had appeared out of nowhere after she had begun making noise about Meridian Chemical. Catherine had written in angry, underlined script, "This is not random bureaucratic incompetence. This is a coordinated strategy of legal and financial harassment designed to overwhelm me, to force me to choose between fighting their environmental crimes and fighting to keep my home. They are weaponizing the regulatory system itself, turning the very agencies that should be protecting public health into instruments of corporate intimidation." Sarah added up the total fines and required repairs, over $70,000, due in less than 60 days, an amount that was completely impossible for her to pay, and she understood with cold, bitter clarity that this was the point, that Donald Vance's $50,000 offer had not been a generous buyout, but rather the setup for this crushing campaign, because now she would be desperate, now she would be drowning in debt. A comment. Sarah had enrolled Emma in Pine Valley Elementary School the week before, desperate to give her daughter some sense of normalcy amid the chaos consuming their lives, and on a bright Thursday morning, she arrived early for the parent-teacher conference that Emma's kindergarten teacher had requested. Rebecca Chen was a young woman in her late 20s, with kind eyes and an easy smile, and she immediately put Sarah at ease by showing her Emma's artwork and explaining how well the little girl was adapting to her new classroom. They spoke about reading levels and social development, and then, as Sarah was gathering her things to leave, Rebecca asked, in a carefully casual tone, where they were living. And when Sarah mentioned the Hartley property, she watched the teacher's expression transform from professional friendliness to something much more intense and personal. "The Hartley Mansion," Rebecca said quietly, glancing toward the classroom door to make sure they were alone. "My mother used to talk about Catherine Hartley, about how she was trying to help people like us, people in the downstream communities who were getting sick and didn't know why." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of her desk, and Sarah could see the weight of old grief in her eyes. "My mother died 5 years ago, pancreatic cancer, extremely aggressive and rare, and she was only 48 years old. We lived in Harper Creek, one of the towns that draws water from the contaminated aquifer, and at her funeral, I looked around and realized that half the people there had lost someone to cancer, or were fighting it themselves, or had children with leukemia. It wasn't normal, it wasn't just bad luck, but no one would talk about it. Because talking about it meant acknowledging what everyone knew but was too afraid to say out loud." Rebecca's voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper. "My father, James Chen, he worked as a safety engineer at Meridian Chemical for 20 years, from 1988 to 2008, and he saw things, documented things, violations and shortcuts, and deliberate decisions to ignore safety protocols because fixing the problems would hurt quarterly profits. He was too afraid to be a whistleblower while he was working there. He had a family to support, and they made it very clear what happened to people who caused trouble. But after my mother died, after he realized that his own silence might have contributed to her death, he started keeping records, copying documents, building his own archive of evidence. He's been living with that guilt for 5 years, and he's been waiting, hoping that someday someone would be brave enough or desperate enough to actually fight them." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the terrible isolation she had been feeling, the crushing sense that she was alone against an impossibly powerful enemy. "Would he be willing to talk to me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly with hope and fear in equal measure. Rebecca nodded, pulling out her phone and typing quickly. "He lives just outside of town, and I'll call him tonight. He's going to want to meet you, Sarah. Because he's been following what's been happening to you, the building inspections and the fines, and he recognizes the pattern because he saw them do the exact same thing to Catherine Hartley 15 years ago. My father has documentation of safety violations going back decades, internal memos, engineering reports that were suppressed, maintenance records that prove they knew their containment systems were failing. And he has names, specific people in management who made the decisions to prioritize profit over human lives. He can't bring my mother back, but he thinks maybe, if someone is finally willing to stand up and fight, he can help make sure no other families have to bury their mothers and daughters and sons the way we did." That evening, after putting Emma to bed and sitting alone in Catherine's office surrounded by journals and research notes, Sarah found herself reading through a leather-bound diary from February 2008, just weeks before Catherine's disappearance, and her eyes caught on a strange entry that seemed out of place among the scientific observations and legal strategies. Catherine had written in tight, urgent script, "They're following me now, black sedan, 2 men, not even trying to hide it anymore. I've made copies of everything, but copies can be destroyed or stolen. The originals need to go somewhere they can't reach, somewhere they won't think to look, where fire can't burn and water can't rot. Where Prometheus gave his gift, there the truth will wait." Sarah read the passage 3 times, her mind working through the cryptic phrasing, and then it clicked with sudden electric clarity. Prometheus, the Greek titan who gave fire to humanity, and where fire can't burn would be somewhere fireproof, and the most fireproof thing in the entire mansion was the massive stone hearth that dominated the main living room. She went downstairs with a flashlight, her heart pounding with the thrill of discovery, and knelt before the cold fireplace, running her hands over the river stones that formed its base and sides. Most of them were mortared solidly in place, but near the left side of the hearth, about 2 feet from the floor, she found one stone that shifted slightly when she pressed it, and when she worked her fingers around its edges and pulled, it came free with a grinding scrape to reveal a dark cavity behind it. Nestled in the space was a heavy steel box, about the size of a large shoebox, with a fireproof seal around its edges and a simple combination lock. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the safe, and then remembered another entry from Catherine's journal, a seemingly random string of numbers that she had dismissed as a GPS coordinate but now recognized as something else. 150385. The date Meridian Chemicals processing plant had opened, March 15th, 1985. She spun the combination dial with trembling fingers, and the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent house like a bell marking the end of 15 years of buried secrets. Inside the safe, protected from time and the elements, were 3 items that represented Catherine Hartley's final, desperate act of defiance. The first was a thick folder containing what appeared to be original documents, not photocopies like the ones in the office files, but actual internal Meridian memos on company letterhead, engineering reports with official stamps and signatures, and maintenance logs that showed a systematic pattern of ignored safety violations and deliberately falsified inspection records. The second item was a small flash drive in a protective case, labeled in Catherine's handwriting. Confidential testimony, 3 witnesses. March 2008. The third item made Sarah's eyes blur with tears. It was a letter, written on plain white paper, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Sarah unfolded it with reverent care and began to read Catherine's final words, written in the same precise script that filled all her journals. "If you are reading this, then I am almost certainly dead, and they have won in silencing me, but they have not won in burying the truth. My name is Catherine Hartley, and I have spent 6 years documenting crimes against humanity committed by Meridian Chemical Corporation. They are poisoning entire communities, knowingly and deliberately, because it is cheaper to let people die than to fix their failing infrastructure. I know they are following me now. I know that powerful people want me silenced, but I cannot and will not abandon the families who are suffering while I still have breath in my body. This safe contains proof of corporate manslaughter, internal documents that show knowledge and intent, testimony from employees willing to expose the truth, and my own scientific analysis that establishes causation beyond any reasonable doubt. I am hiding this evidence because I know they will come for my files, they will destroy my research, and they will try to make it seem like I was a paranoid conspiracy theorist with no credible proof. But the truth cannot be destroyed if someone has the courage to carry it forward. To whoever finds this, please finish what I started. Please give these families the justice they deserve, and please know that every day of silence costs lives." Sarah met James Chen at his modest house on the outskirts of town 2 days later, with Rebecca there to make the introduction. And she immediately understood why this man had been paralyzed by guilt for so long, because his face carried the weight of someone who had watched preventable suffering and done nothing. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the careful, methodical manner of an engineer, and when Sarah showed him the flash drive from Catherine's safe, his hands trembled as he took it, turning it over as if it were a holy relic. "I helped her encrypt this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "back in March of 2008, just days before she vanished, because the 3 people whose testimony is on here were terrified, and they wanted assurance that their identities could be protected until they were ready to go public." He led Sarah to his small home office, where an old laptop sat on the desk, a ruggedized model from the mid-2000s that looked like it had been designed for military use, and he explained that it was the same machine he had used to help Catherine, that he had kept it hidden and maintained all these years because some part of him had always hoped this moment would come. He powered it up, inserted the flash drive, and entered a long encryption key from memory, and after several tense minutes of processing, 3 video files appeared on the screen. The first witness was a man named David Kowalski, who had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the Meridian facility from 1987 to 2007, and his recorded testimony, filmed in what looked like Catherine's greenhouse laboratory, was devastating in its specificity. He described how the underground chemical storage tanks had developed stress fractures as early as 1989, how the containment barriers that were supposed to prevent leakage into the surrounding bedrock had been installed incorrectly and were essentially non-functional, and how he had personally witnessed millions of gallons of untreated industrial waste being pumped directly into disposal wells that fed straight into the aquifer system. "I reported it to my supervisors," Kowalski said on the video, his face haggard with shame and fear, "and they told me to stop making waves. That the company's lawyers had determined it was cheaper to deal with potential lawsuits than to shut down operations for the 6 months it would take to properly fix the containment systems. And when I pushed back, they made it very clear that I could either keep my mouth shut or find myself unemployed in a town where Meridian was the only major employer. The second witness was Maria Santos, a laboratory technician who had worked in Meridian's environmental testing division from 1995 to 2007, and she testified that she had been explicitly ordered by management to falsify water quality reports, to dilute contaminated samples before testing so they would show acceptable levels, and to backdate clean samples to cover periods when contamination had been particularly severe. They had a whole system, she explained, her voice shaking with anger and fear, and everyone in the lab knew what was happening, but we also knew what happened to people who talked. Because in 2003, another technician tried to blow the whistle, and within a month, he was fired on fabricated charges of data theft, blacklisted from every environmental lab in the state, and last I heard, he was working retail because no one in the industry would touch him. The third witness was Frank Morrison, who had been a safety compliance officer from 1992 to 2008, and his testimony tied everything together with horrifying clarity. He had documentation proving that senior management had paid monthly bribes to county health inspectors and state environmental regulators, that they had contributed heavily to the election campaigns of local politicians, who then ensured that Meridian's operations were never scrutinized too closely, and that when Catherine Hartley had begun her investigation, there had been explicit discussions at the executive level about how to neutralize the threat she represented. Sarah jolted awake at 2 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass, a sharp crystalline crash that shattered the mountain silence and sent adrenaline flooding through her system with such force that she was out of bed and moving before her mind had fully processed what she had heard. The sound had come from downstairs, from the direction of Catherine's office, and through the darkness she could see the faint beam of flashlights moving systematically through the lower floor, at least 2 of them, sweeping back and forth with the methodical efficiency of professionals conducting a search. Her first thought was Emma, sleeping peacefully in the room down the hall, and Sarah moved on silent feet toward her daughter's doorway, her heart hammering so violently she was certain it would give her away. She could hear them now, the intruders, their voices low and urgent as they moved through the office. Find the safe, find the flash drive. She has to have them somewhere, and boss wants everything, documents, samples, computer files. Burn it all if we have to. Sarah slipped into Emma's room and gently closed the door with barely a whisper of sound, then grabbed her phone from her pocket with shaking hands and dialed 911, keeping her voice at an urgent whisper as she reported the break-in and gave her address to the dispatcher, who promised that deputies were en route. She gathered Emma, who woke with confused murmurs, and pressed her finger to her daughter's lips in the universal gesture for silence, then positioned them both in the closet behind a rack of clothes, her body a shield between her child and the door, her mind racing through terrible scenarios of what would happen if the intruders came upstairs before help arrived. The minutes stretched like hours, and she could hear the men growing increasingly frustrated, drawers being yanked open and dumped, furniture being moved roughly across the floor. And then one of them said something that made her blood run cold. "Check upstairs, maybe she's got it in the bedroom." Sarah clutched Emma tighter, holding her breath. And then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, sirens, distant but growing rapidly louder, and the immediate panic in the intruders' voices as they realized their time was up. "Go, go now," one of them hissed, and she heard the sound of running footsteps, a door slamming, and then an engine roaring to life, and tires spinning on gravel as a vehicle fled down the driveway. She waited until she heard the official knock on the front door before emerging from the closet with Emma, and when she opened it, she found herself facing Sheriff Brookshire, the same man whose dismissive attitude had been documented in Catherine's journals, a large man in his late 50s with a thick mustache and cold, calculating eyes that swept over her and the house with an expression that managed to convey both contempt and warning. "Ma'am, we received a call about a break-in," he said with exaggerated patience, as if she were a child reporting a monster under the bed. And when Sarah showed him the shattered window and the ransacked office with papers scattered across the floor and filing cabinets standing open, he walked through with his hands in his pockets, making a show of examining things without actually documenting anything or collecting evidence. "Probably just kids looking for copper wire or anything they can sell," he concluded after a cursory 5-minute inspection. Ignoring Sarah's insistence that she had heard them specifically talking about documents and flash drives, these old abandoned properties attract that sort of thing, especially when people try to live in them without proper security. His gaze hardened as he looked at her directly. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to be straight with you. This property has a history, and it's not a safe place for a woman alone with a young child. Maybe you should reconsider your living situation here, for your daughter's sake if nothing else. I'd hate to see something more serious happen because you were too stubborn to take good advice." The morning after the break-in, with Emma safely at school and the ransacked office serving as a stark reminder of how dangerous her situation had become, Sarah sat at Catherine's desk and faced the brutal truth. She was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and fighting a battle she could not win alone with local authorities who were either compromised or too terrified to help. She needed someone outside this corrupted system, someone with the resources and platform to take on a corporate giant. And after hours of desperate internet searching, she found a name that appeared repeatedly in articles about environmental crimes and corporate malfeasance: Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist based in Helena who had built a reputation for taking on powerful interests and winning. She called his office number with trembling hands, half expecting to be dismissed or ignored, but he answered on the third ring with a brisk, professional tone that immediately made her feel like she was wasting the time of someone far too important to care about her problems. "Mr. Webb, my name is Sarah Mitchell, and I have evidence of corporate environmental crimes that have been killing people for decades, and I need your help because the local authorities are part of the cover-up," she said in a rush, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line that felt like judgment. "Ma'am, I get about 20 calls a week from people who think they've uncovered the conspiracy of the century," Webb replied with the weary patience of someone who had heard every crackpot theory imaginable. "What makes your evidence different from all the others?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to explain. Catherine Hartley's disappearance, the hidden safe, the internal Meridian documents, the water samples, the video testimony, the systematic harassment, and the midnight break-in. And as she spoke, she heard the quality of his attention change from polite skepticism to genuine interest. "I'll drive out tomorrow," he said finally, "but I need to see the actual evidence, not just hear about it. And if this is real, if it's as solid as you're claiming, then we need to talk about what you're walking into." Marcus Webb arrived the next afternoon in a dusty sedan filled with camera equipment and file boxes, and he was not what Sarah had expected. A man in his 40s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt, looking more like a college professor than the hardened investigative journalist she had imagined. He spent 4 hours going through everything, reading Catherine's journals, examining the internal memos, watching the video testimony with an expression that grew progressively darker, and analyzing the water sample data with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a diagnosis of terminal illness. "This is the real thing," he said quietly. "This is prosecutable evidence of knowing, deliberate corporate manslaughter on a scale that could result in criminal charges and bankruptcy-level civil damages. But you need to understand what you're up against, Sarah. Meridian Chemical is owned by Apex Industries, which is one of the 50 largest corporations in America, with revenue in the billions and political connections that reach all the way to Washington. They have lawyers who are paid 7 figures annually just to make problems like this disappear, and they have the resources to bury you in litigation, harassment, and intimidation that will make what you've experienced so far look like a gentle warning." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of respect and concern. "Catherine's evidence is extraordinary, but it's 15 years old, and their lawyers will argue that conditions have changed, that these were isolated incidents from a different management team, that the company has since reformed its practices, and without living witnesses willing to testify under oath, without current evidence of ongoing contamination, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. So before we go public with this story, we need to find those 3 people on the videos and convince them to come forward." Marcus Webb had connections and investigative resources that Sarah could never have accessed alone, and within 2 days he had tracked down current information on all 3 witnesses from Catherine's video testimony. Though what he discovered was a mixture of hope and heartbreak that painted a grim picture of what happened to people who threatened Meridian's interests. David Kowalski, the maintenance supervisor who had witnessed the illegal dumping firsthand, had moved to Portland, Oregon in 2009, and Marcus made contact with him by phone. Explaining the situation, and the importance of his testimony in building a federal case. Sarah listened on speakerphone as Kowalski's voice, older and wearier than in the video, responded with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. "I'm sorry, I truly am, but I can't help you," he said, and Sarah could hear genuine anguish beneath his refusal. "I have 3 kids now, 2 in college and 1 in high school, and I've spent 15 years looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, and I finally have some peace, some normalcy. What happened to Catherine Hartley wasn't an accident, and everyone who worked at that plant knew it, and I'm not putting my family in that kind of danger, not even for justice." Marcus tried to persuade him, explaining the protections they could arrange, but Kowalski ended the call with quiet desperation. "You don't understand what these people are capable of. They have unlimited resources and no conscience, and I'm not brave enough to fight them." The second name on their list, Maria Santos, required a different kind of investigation, and what Marcus discovered made Sarah's blood run cold with the confirmation of her darkest suspicions. Maria had left Montana in late 2008, just months after Catherine's disappearance, and had settled in Spokane, Washington, where she had found work as a laboratory technician at a medical clinic. On January 15, 2010, her car had gone off the road during a rainstorm on a relatively straight stretch of highway, crashed through a guardrail, and plunged down a steep embankment, killing her instantly. The official accident report noted excessive speed for conditions and possible driver impairment. But Marcus had pulled the full investigation file through his media contacts, and it revealed troubling inconsistencies. Witnesses reported seeing a dark sedan following Maria's vehicle closely before the accident. Her brake lines showed unusual wear patterns that the investigator had noted but not explained, and her family had insisted she was a cautious driver who never exceeded speed limits and hadn't had a drink in years. The case had been closed within 2 weeks with minimal investigation, and reading through the file, Sarah understood with sickening certainty that Maria Santos had not died in an accident, but had been murdered, eliminated because she had given testimony that threatened a multi-billion-dollar corporation. That left Frank Morrison, the safety compliance officer whose testimony had detailed the bribes and executive-level discussions about neutralizing Catherine's threat, and tracking him down proved more difficult because he had essentially disappeared from public records after leaving Montana. Marcus finally located him through property tax records. He owned a small cabin on 20 acres of isolated land in the far northwest corner of the state, 3 hours from Sarah's location. Living completely off-grid with no phone, no internet, and no apparent desire to be found. They drove out together, following increasingly primitive roads until they reached a hand-painted sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing," and when they finally found the cabin, a lean man in his late 50s with haunted eyes and a hunting rifle met them on the porch. Marcus identified himself, explained why they had come, and after a long, tense silence, Frank Morrison lowered his weapon and invited them inside, his hands shaking as he poured coffee into chipped mugs. "I've been waiting for someone to come," he said quietly, his voice raw with 15 years of carried guilt. "Every day since Catherine died, I've been waiting, because I knew what they did. I heard them planning it. And I said nothing. I protected myself and let a good woman be murdered, and I have to live with that." He looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much and slept too little. And when she asked if he would testify, if he would go on record with everything he knew, he nodded slowly, his decision already made long ago in the private hell of his conscience. "Yes, but only if you can guarantee federal protection, witness protection if necessary, because I know what happened to Maria Santos, and I know her accident wasn't an accident." Sarah returned from her meeting with Frank Morrison, feeling a cautious hope that was immediately shattered the moment she turned onto the driveway leading to the mansion and saw something small and wrong sitting on the front porch. Steps. Her stomach dropped with a mother's instinctive dread before her conscious mind had even processed what she was seeing, and she brought the truck to a stop with shaking hands, her heart hammering against her ribs as she approached on foot, leaving the engine running in case she needed to flee quickly. There, placed with deliberate care in the exact center of the top step where she could not possibly miss it, was Mr. Hoppy, Emma's beloved stuffed rabbit that had been with them through evictions and hungry nights and every hard moment of their lives, and driven through his soft fabric body was a large hunting knife, pinning him to the weathered wood like a grotesque specimen in a collector's display. Attached to the knife's handle with a rubber band was a folded piece of paper, and Sarah's hands trembled so violently she could barely unfold it to read the message written in blocky, untraceable letters. Children need their mothers. Mothers need to make smart choices. This is your last warning. The words hit her like physical blows, stealing the air from her lungs, and for a moment she thought she might vomit right there on the porch, as the full weight of what they were threatening crashed down on her. Because this was no longer about harassment or intimidation or financial pressure. This was a direct threat against Emma, against her baby, and Sarah felt terror unlike anything she had ever experienced, flood through her system with paralyzing force. But beneath that terror, rising up from some deep place she had not known existed within herself, came a white-hot fury that burned away the fear and left something harder and more dangerous in its place. Because these people, these criminals who poisoned children with contaminated water and murdered women who tried to expose them, had now threatened her daughter. And that was the line that transformed Sarah from a frightened woman trying to survive into something far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose. She pulled out her phone with steady hands that surprised her and methodically photographed the scene from every angle, wide shots showing the knife and rabbit in context of the porch, close-ups of the note with its threatening message clearly visible, detail shots of the knife itself, which might carry fingerprints or other forensic evidence, and time-stamped images that would establish exactly when this threat had been delivered. She carefully removed the knife using a dish towel to preserve any potential evidence, placed both the weapon and the note in separate plastic bags, and added them to the growing file of documentation she was building. The citations from the building inspector, the health department violations, the sheriff's dismissive incident report from the break-in, and now this explicit threat against her child. She called Rebecca Chen with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and when she explained what had happened, Rebecca's response was immediate and fierce. "Pack Emma's things. She's staying with us until this is over. My father has a security system and my husband was in the Marines. She'll be safe here, and you can fight these bastards without worrying every second about whether they're going to hurt your baby." Sarah drove Emma to the Chen household that evening, and explaining to her 5-year-old daughter why she couldn't come home, why she had to stay with Miss Rebecca for a while, was one of the hardest conversations of her life. Made slightly easier only by Emma's excitement at the prospect of a sleepover and her innocent acceptance of Sarah's explanation that Mama had to do some very important work. After Emma was settled in the Chen's guest room, chattering happily with Rebecca about what they would have for breakfast, Sarah sat with Rebecca and James in their kitchen and showed them the photographs of the mutilated stuffed rabbit and the threatening note. And James Chen's face went pale as he recognized the tactics he had seen deployed against others who had threatened Meridian's interests over his 20 years with the company. "They're escalating because you're getting close, because Frank Morrison agreeing to testify terrifies them," he said quietly, pulling out his own laptop and opening an encrypted folder he had been maintaining for years. "And I think it's time I added my testimony to his. Because I have documentation they don't know exists, and I'm done being afraid." That night, back at the mansion alone for the first time since arriving, Sarah did not sleep. Instead, she sat at Catherine Hartley's desk under the circle of lamplight, and wrote down everything that had happened in meticulous detail, creating a timeline of harassment and threats that read like a prosecutor's dream, a clear pattern of witness, intimidation, and obstruction that would add federal charges to the already devastating case they were building. And with each word she typed, she felt herself transforming from victim to warrior, from someone being hunted into someone who was hunting back. Donald Vance arrived 3 days after the incident with Mr. Hoppy, his black Mercedes pulling up to the mansion with the same predatory confidence as before. But this time Sarah was ready for him. Having anticipated this visit and prepared accordingly by setting her phone to record audio and placing it in her shirt pocket with the microphone positioned to capture everything that would be said. He emerged from his vehicle carrying the same leather briefcase, but his smile as he approached the porch had acquired a harder edge, the veneer of professional courtesy worn thin by her continued resistance to what he clearly considered inevitable. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his tone still attempting warmth but failing to mask the underlying threat, "I'm here to make you a final offer, and I strongly encourage you to consider it very carefully for the sake of your daughter's future." He opened his briefcase with theatrical precision and pulled out a document that was considerably thicker than the simple purchase agreement he had offered before, laying it on the porch railing between them. "Meridian Chemical Corporation is prepared to purchase this property for $100,000, payable immediately upon signing. along with an additional $50,000 to cover your relocation expenses and any inconvenience you've experienced during your brief time here. The amount was staggering. More money than Sarah had ever imagined possessing. Enough to give Emma every opportunity Sarah herself had never had. But she had learned by now that the size of the offer was directly proportional to their desperation, and desperation meant she had something they truly feared. "And what would I have to do for that $150,000? Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt, and Vance's smile tightened as he flipped to a specific page in the document, his manicured finger pointing to a dense block of legal text. "You would be required to sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement, stating that you have found no evidence of any wrongdoing by Meridian Chemical Corporation or its employees, that you will not make any public statements regarding the company or this property, that you will surrender any and all documents or materials currently in your possession that relate to the company's operations, and that you agree to permanent non-disclosure of any information you may have acquired during your residency here." He paused, letting the terms sink in, and when Sarah remained silent, his facade finally cracked completely, the professional attorney disappearing to reveal something far more dangerous underneath. "Let me be very clear about your situation, Miss Mitchell, because I don't think you fully understand what you're dealing with," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than if he had shouted. "Meridian Chemical knows everything about what you've been doing. We've been monitoring your phone calls. We know you've been meeting with Marcus Webb. We know you've been talking to James Chen and tracking down our former employees. And we know you think you're building some kind of case against us." He stepped closer, invading her personal space with calculated intimidation. "But here's what you don't know. We have legal teams that have successfully defended against the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Justice, and class action lawsuits involving thousands of plaintiffs, and we have crushed every single threat that has ever been raised against us. Catherine Hartley thought she could expose us, and where is she now? Disappeared into those mountains 15 years ago, an unfortunate accident that no one could prevent. Maria Santos thought she was safe in Washington, and then her car went off the road on a clear day. These things happen, Miss Mitchell. Tragic accidents happen to people who don't understand when they're outmatched, when they're playing a game whose rules they don't comprehend." His eyes held hers with cold certainty. "You have a 5-year-old daughter staying with the Chen family. Sweet little Emma, who draws pictures of butterflies at school, and children need their mothers, healthy mothers who are alive and present, not martyrs who sacrifice their families for some pointless crusade that was doomed from the start." Sarah felt ice water run through her veins at the explicit threat, at the casual way he mentioned Emma's name and what she drew at school, proving that their surveillance was comprehensive and ongoing. But she also felt her phone recording every word in her pocket, capturing his threats, his admission of monitoring, his implications about Catherine's death and Maria's accident, and she knew with absolute certainty that Donald Vance had just made a catastrophic mistake by underestimating a desperate mother who had learned to fight back. "I need some time to review the offer," Sarah said carefully, giving him nothing, and Vance's expression showed his satisfaction at what he interpreted as capitulation. "You have 48 hours, he said, collecting his briefcase. "After that, the offer expires, and other measures will be taken to resolve this situation permanently." He walked back to his Mercedes and drove away. And Sarah stood on the porch listening to the recording playback, hearing every threat, every admission, every piece of evidence that would destroy him and everyone he represented. Sarah arrived at James Chen's house the evening after recording Vance's threats, and she found him waiting in his home office, surrounded by decades of documentation, engineering manuals, and the kind of technical specifications that most people would find incomprehensible, but that told him a story of calculated evil. He had Rebecca make coffee while he spread out a series of diagrams on his large desk, blueprints of the Meridian chemical facility that he had copied during his years working there, and as Sarah sat beside him, he began to explain with the methodical precision of an engineer who had spent years understanding exactly how the crime had been committed. "I need you to understand something fundamental," James began, pointing to a schematic of the facility's waste management system. "What Meridian has done is not the result of negligence or poor oversight or unfortunate accidents. It is the result of a deliberate, calculated decision made at the highest levels of management to save money by poisoning people, and I can prove it with mathematics and engineering principles that are irrefutable." He pulled out a thick binder filled with cost analyses and technical specifications that he had been compiling for years. When Meridian built this facility in 1985, they had two options for handling their chemical waste. Option 1 was proper disposal, which meant installing a state-of-the-art treatment system that would neutralize the toxic compounds before disposal, using lined containment facilities that met EPA specifications, and contracting with licensed hazardous waste transportation companies to remove materials that couldn't be treated on site. The total cost for this system, based on the engineering proposals I found in the archives, would have been approximately $8 million in initial capital investment, plus $1.2 million in annual operating expenses. He flipped to another section showing the alternative they had chosen. Option 2 was what they actually built. A cheap, inadequate system using outdated underground storage tanks without proper corrosion protection, disposal wells that pumped untreated waste directly into fractured bedrock, and minimal monitoring equipment that could be easily manipulated to show compliance. This system cost $2 million to install and roughly $400,000 annually to operate, saving them $6 million upfront and $800,000 every single year thereafter. Sarah did the math in her head, and the numbers made her feel physically ill. Over 30 years of operation, Meridian had saved approximately $30 million by choosing the inadequate system, not counting the capital investment difference, bringing the total savings to somewhere around $36 million. James nodded grimly when she voiced this calculation. Actually, it's worse than that. Because in 1989, when their storage tanks began to fail and their disposal wells showed signs of contaminating the aquifer, they received engineering reports, which I helped write, recommending immediate remediation at a cost of $12 million and a 6-month operational shutdown that would have cost another $15 million in lost production. Senior management rejected the proposal, and I found the memo explaining why. He pulled out a photocopy of a document that Sarah recognized from Catherine's files, but James had additional pages showing the complete cost-benefit analysis that corporate executives had commissioned. They had their legal department and risk management team calculate the potential liability from health-related lawsuits, and even assuming that contamination was eventually discovered and proven, they estimated maximum settlement costs of $25 million spread over decades of litigation. And the memo explicitly states that this was significantly less than the cost of proper remediation and operational modifications, and therefore the financially optimal decision was to continue operations as is and percented, deal with lawsuits if and when they materialized. Rebecca, who had been listening from the doorway, made a sound of disgust. They put a price on my mother's life, on all those people dying of cancer. They did the calculation and decided it was cheaper to let them die. James's hands were shaking as he laid out the final piece of evidence, a spreadsheet he had reconstructed showing the complete financial picture. Over the 30 years from 1985 to 2015, Meridian Chemical saved approximately $40 million by choosing inadequate waste management and refusing to remediate when problems were identified, while the 3 downstream communities experienced a documented increase in cancer cases that has resulted in at least 200 excess deaths, with hundreds more people currently suffering from cancer and other illnesses directly attributable to the contamination. This is not manslaughter through negligence, Sarah. This is premeditated corporate murder. Because they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew people would die, and they made a conscious, calculated decision that those deaths were an acceptable cost of doing business. He showed her one final document, an internal strategy memo from 2007, when Catherine Hartley had begun her investigation. When Catherine started making noise, they didn't respond by finally fixing the problem. They responded by calculating how much it would cost to silence her, to buy off local officials, to intimidate witnesses, and to manage the public relations if she somehow managed to go public. And every single option they considered was still cheaper than actually stopping the poisoning, which tells you everything you need to know about how these people think. Sarah stared at the mountain of evidence, understanding finally and completely that she was not fighting against a corporation that had made mistakes. She was fighting against an organization that had deliberately chosen to kill people for profit and would continue killing to protect those profits. Marcus Webb had spent 20 years cultivating sources within federal agencies, building relationships with the kind of career investigators who valued truth over politics, and within 48 hours of reviewing Catherine Hartley's complete evidence file, He had made contact with someone who had been waiting years for exactly this opportunity. Special Agent Lisa Torres of the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit arrived in Montana 3 days later, flying in from the FBI's Denver field office with 2 junior agents and the quiet intensity of someone who had been building a case brick by brick for half a decade, waiting for the keystone that would finally allow everything to fall into place. She was a woman in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, dressed in the standard FBI uniform of dark suit and sensible shoes. And when Sarah met her at Marcus Webb's hotel room where they had assembled all of Catherine's evidence, Torres spent the first hour simply listening, taking meticulous notes in a leather portfolio while Sarah, Marcus, and James Chen walked her through everything: the hidden safe, the water samples, the internal memos, the video testimony, the systematic harassment, the midnight break-in, and finally, the recording of Donald Vance's threats. When they finished, Torres sat back in her chair and released a long breath, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. "I've been investigating Apex Industries and its subsidiaries for 6 years," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of frustration and barely contained hope. "We suspected environmental crimes at multiple facilities. We had circumstantial evidence and witness statements that couldn't be corroborated, and we had a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappeared witnesses that suggested obstruction and possibly worse. But we've never had anything approaching the level of documentation you've assembled here." She tapped the folder containing Catherine's evidence with one finger. "The internal memos alone are extraordinary because they show knowledge and intent at the executive level, which transforms this from a regulatory violation into a criminal conspiracy. And the video testimony from your witnesses, combined with James Chen's technical analysis, gives us causation and mechanism. The water samples, if they can be authenticated and shown to have proper chain of custody, are physical evidence that can't be explained away or dismissed. And the recording of Donald Vance making explicit threats while admitting to surveillance and implying involvement in Catherine Hartley's death is prosecutorial gold." She opened her portfolio and began outlining what would happen next. "I'm opening a formal federal investigation as of today. We'll be interviewing Frank Morrison under witness protection protocols. We'll subpoena Meridian's complete operational records going back to 1985. And we'll be coordinating with the EPA to conduct independent water testing that will either confirm or refute Catherine's findings. We'll also be looking very hard at Catherine Hartley's disappearance and Maria Santos's accident, because if we can prove that Meridian was involved in either death, we're talking about murder charges against corporate executives, which changes everything." But then her expression grew serious, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping low. "However, I need you to understand the timeline we're working with, because building a federal case against a corporation of this size, with this level of legal resources, requires absolute precision and ironclad evidence that can withstand the most aggressive defense attorney's money can buy. We're looking at 6 months minimum before we can seek indictments, possibly a year before trial. And during that entire time, you, Sarah, are going to be in considerable danger because Meridian doesn't know yet that the FBI is involved. And they're going to continue to see you as a threat that needs to be eliminated." She pulled out a card and slid it across the table. "This is my direct number. It rings to my personal cell 24 hours a day. And if you feel threatened, if anything happens that concerns you, you call me immediately. We can have agents on site within 2 hours. But I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that we can provide round-the-clock protection, because we don't have the resources for that, and we can't risk alerting Meridian that federal law enforcement is involved before we're ready to move." Torres's gaze held Sarah's with absolute seriousness. "What you've done, what Catherine Hartley did, is incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous, and I need you to stay alive long enough for us to bring these people to justice, which means you need to be smart, you need to be careful, and you need to accept that the next few months are going to be the most dangerous period of your life because cornered predators are always most vicious right before they're finally brought down." Sarah took the card with predators, hands that were steadier than they had been in weeks, because for the first time since finding Catherine's evidence, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone anymore, like there was finally someone with real power on her side, even if that power would take time to fully deploy. Sarah had fallen into an uneasy sleep just after midnight, exhausted from another day of coordinating with Agent Torres and preparing her testimony. when she woke to a smell that sent primal alarms screaming through her nervous system before her conscious mind had even identified it. Smoke, thick and acrid. The unmistakable scent of a structure fire already well underway. She bolted upright in the darkness of Catherine's old bedroom on the second floor, and even in those first disoriented seconds, she could see the orange glow flickering beneath the bedroom door and hear the terrifying crackle and roar of flames consuming the floor below. Her survival instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of disaster, took over with crystalline clarity. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, called 911 with shaking fingers while pulling on her boots, and screamed her address to the dispatcher before the woman had even finished her greeting. Then she turned to the one thing in this burning building that mattered more than her own life. The fireproof safe containing Catherine's original evidence that she had moved to her bedroom for exactly this kind of scenario. The safe was heavy, at least 40 pounds of steel and insulation, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed as she hefted it under one arm and stumbled toward the bedroom window, the smoke already beginning to seep under the door in thick, poisonous tendrils that burned her lungs with each breath. She could hear the fire now, a living thing with its own terrible voice, consuming the dried timber of the mansion's first floor with a hunger that seemed almost intelligent in its ferocity. And she knew with absolute certainty that this was no accident, that somewhere outside in the darkness were the people who had set this blaze, who had finally decided that the most permanent solution to their Sarah Mitchell problem was to burn her alive and destroy all evidence in one brutal move. The bedroom door was already hot to the touch, the old wood beginning to char from the inferno on the other side, and Sarah knew that trying to go down the staircase would be suicide, which left only one option: the window that looked out over the porch roof. She used her boot to kick out the glass, the shards falling away to reveal the cold mountain air and the steep pitch of the porch roof below, and without allowing herself time to think about the drop or the angle or the very real possibility of breaking her neck, she shoved the safe through the opening and let it tumble down the roof to fall with a heavy thud into the overgrown garden below. Then she climbed through herself, her hands gripping the window frame as she lowered her body onto the roof's surface, the old shingles crumbling under her weight, the angle far steeper than it had looked from inside, and she could feel the heat from the fire below beginning to radiate through the roof itself as the flames found their way into the walls and ceiling. She half slid, half fell down the pitch, her fingers scraping uselessly against the deteriorating shingles until she reached the edge and tumbled off into empty air, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs and send stars exploding across her vision. She lay there for precious seconds, gasping and disoriented, before the sound of the fire's roar brought her back to herself, and she crawled through the overgrown grass to where the safe had landed, gathering it into her arms like a child and stumbling away from the mansion toward the driveway where her truck sat. Behind her, the building that had been Catherine Hartley's home, that had sheltered her own desperate hopes for a new beginning, was being consumed by flames that had found the old dried wood and were transforming it into a massive bonfire that lit up the night sky with terrible beauty. She could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer, but she knew they would be too late, that by the time the volunteer fire department navigated the dirt roads to this remote location, there would be nothing left to save. The fire trucks arrived 15 minutes later, 3 of them with crews that did their professional best, but the mansion was already a total loss, the walls collapsing inward, the roof gone, the stone fireplace and chimney standing alone like a tombstone marking what had once been. The fire marshal, a tired man named Hicks who had probably been roused from his bed, conducted a preliminary investigation as dawn was breaking, walking through the smoking ruins with practiced caution, and when he came to speak with Sarah, who was sitting in the back of an ambulance being treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation, his conclusion was delivered with the bureaucratic certainty of someone reading from a script. "Looks like an electrical fire. Started somewhere in the vicinity of the main floor wiring. These old houses with outdated electrical systems, it's a common problem. Real tragedy, but not surprising given the age and condition of the structure." Sarah, her voice hoarse from smoke and fury, clutched the fireproof safe tighter and met his eyes with absolute conviction, saying what she knew he already understood but would never officially acknowledge. "This wasn't an accident. Someone burned my house down to kill me and destroy evidence of corporate crimes, and you know it just as well as I do." Marcus Webb stood with Sarah in the smoking ruins of the Hartley mansion as dawn broke over the mountains, and he made a decision that would transform her from an isolated victim into a national symbol. Pulling out his phone and calling his editor at the Helena Independent, with a voice that carried the controlled fury of a journalist who had finally found the story that justified his entire career. "I'm sending you everything right now, the full investigative package on Meridian Chemical, and I need it to run in tomorrow's edition, front page, above the fold, with the complete digital package going live online immediately, because if we wait any longer, the woman who's risking her life to expose this is going to end up dead." He spent the next 12 hours writing with the kind of focused intensity that comes from knowing lives hang in the balance, crafting a narrative that combined Catherine Hartley's meticulous scientific evidence with Sarah's personal story of courage and corporate intimidation, weaving together the internal memos, the witness testimony, the pattern of harassment, and the final desperate arson attempt into an article that read less like journalism and more like a criminal indictment. The headline he chose was deliberately inflammatory and absolutely accurate: "Corporate Murder. How Meridian Chemical poisoned 3 Montana towns for profit and killed the scientist who tried to stop them." The article ran on Sunday morning, and within hours it had been picked up by the Associated Press, then by Reuters, and by Monday afternoon, every major news network in the country was running segments about the young single mother who had bought a mansion for $1 and uncovered evidence of one of the largest corporate environmental crimes in American history. Marcus had included photographs with the article, images he had taken over the previous weeks documenting Sarah's evidence. But it was one particular photograph that captured the public imagination and transformed the story from a complex environmental scandal into something that resonated at a visceral, emotional level. Sarah standing in front of the charred ruins of the mansion, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion, holding 5-year-old Emma in her arms, the little girl's face pressed against her mother's shoulder, while behind them the skeletal remains of the burned house stood as testament to how far powerful interests would go to protect their profits. That image went viral in the way that only certain photographs can, appearing on the front pages of newspapers across the country, shared millions of times on social media, becoming the visual shorthand for corporate greed and the courage of ordinary people fighting impossible odds. Cable news networks ran packages every hour. CNN brought in environmental law experts to analyze the evidence and discuss the potential criminal charges. MSNBC featured interviews with residents of the poisoned communities who shared their stories of lost loved ones and ongoing illnesses. Fox News even covered it from the angle of government regulatory failure and the importance of individual citizens standing up against corrupt systems. Within 72 hours of publication, the story had achieved the kind of cultural penetration that occurs maybe once or twice a year. The rare moment when a complex issue breaks through the noise of daily news and captures genuine public outrage. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForCatherine and #SaveSarah. GoFundMe campaigns appeared to help Sarah rebuild her life, and legal advocacy groups began organizing pro bono representation for the families in the affected communities. The governor of Montana, facing mounting pressure and the unwelcome national spotlight on environmental failures in his state, ordered an immediate independent investigation and suspended Meridian Chemical's operating permits pending review. The EPA, which had been quietly working with Agent Torres but moving at the glacial pace typical of federal bureaucracy, suddenly found itself under intense scrutiny and fast-tracked its emergency water testing in the 3 downstream communities. And when those results came back showing contamination levels that exceeded federal limits by factors of 10 to 20, the agency had no choice but to declare a public health emergency and order the immediate provision of clean water to all affected residents. Most importantly, from Sarah's perspective, the media attention provided a shield of protection that no amount of FBI resources could have matched. Because Meridian Chemical Corporation could murder people in the shadows, could make isolated whistleblowers disappear and call them accidents. But they could not touch a woman whose face was on every television screen in America without generating the kind of attention that would destroy them faster than any lawsuit. Donald Vance, whose threatening visit had been described in detail in Marcus's article, found himself suspended from his law firm pending an ethics investigation. Sheriff Brookshire was placed on administrative leave while state investigators reviewed his handling of Sarah's complaints, and the executives at Meridian Chemical Corporation and their parent company Apex Industries went into crisis management mode, issuing carefully worded denials and hiring public relations firms to manage the catastrophic damage to their reputation. But the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict, and no amount of corporate spin could erase the image of Sarah and Emma standing in front of their burned home, ordinary people who had stood up to monsters and refused to be silenced. The media firestorm that Marcus Webb's article ignited created a political environment where federal inaction became impossible. And exactly 1 week after the story broke, while morning news shows were still running segments about Sarah's fight against corporate corruption, Special Agent Lisa Torres coordinated a series of simultaneous raids that she had been preparing in secret for months but had finally received authorization to execute. At precisely 6 in the morning Mountain Time, FBI tactical teams served search warrants at 3 locations: Meridian Chemical Corporation's headquarters in Billings, the Flathead County Sheriff's Office, and Donald Vance's law firm in Kalispell, with additional teams fanning out to the homes of key executives and witnesses, all moving with the kind of overwhelming force that left no possibility of destroyed evidence or coordinated resistance. Sarah watched the raids unfold on live television from the Chen family's living room, with Emma playing quietly in the next room and Marcus Webb sitting beside her providing commentary based on his sources within the FBI, and the images of federal agents in tactical gear carrying boxes of documents out of Meridian's corporate offices, while photographers and news crews documented every moment, felt like vindication and validation after weeks of being told she was powerless against such massive corporate interests. Agent Torres, who had become the public face of the investigation, held a press conference at noon that was carried live on every major network, and Sarah watched as the woman who had promised her justice stood behind a podium with the FBI seal and delivered a statement that was remarkable both for its legal precision and its barely contained fury at what the investigation had uncovered. Today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in coordination with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice, has executed search warrants and arrested multiple individuals in connection with what we believe to be one of the most egregious cases of corporate environmental crime in American history. Torres began, her voice calm and professional but with an edge of steel that made it clear this was personal for her. We are charging Meridian Chemical Corporation, its parent company Apex Industries, and 7 individual defendants with conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and environmental terrorism. And we are seeking indictments for attempted murder in connection with the arson fire that destroyed the home of whistleblower Sarah Mitchell. She paused, letting the weight of those charges settle, before continuing with what Sarah knew was the most devastating part of the announcement. Additionally, based on epidemiological evidence gathered by the EPA and corroborated by independent medical experts, we have established a direct causal link between the illegal contamination of the aquifer and 237 cancer deaths in the 3 downstream communities over a 30-year period. And we are therefore charging the corporate defendants and responsible executives with 237 counts of manslaughter under the theory that their knowing, deliberate decision to continue operations despite awareness of the contamination constitutes reckless disregard for human life that directly resulted in these deaths. The press room erupted in shouted questions, but Torres held up her hand for silence and delivered the statement that Sarah had been waiting to hear for months. We are also reopening the investigation into the 2008 disappearance of Dr. Catherine Hartley and the 2010 death of Maria Santos, as we now have evidence suggesting that both women were murdered to prevent their testimony regarding Meridian's illegal activities, and we believe additional charges, including murder and conspiracy to commit murder, may be forthcoming as that investigation proceeds. She concluded by thanking Sarah Mitchell by name for her courage in preserving Catherine Hartley's evidence and coming forward despite sustained intimidation and threats to her life, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched this federal agent, backed by the full power of the United States government, validate everything she had risked and suffered. The arrests came quickly after that. Sheriff Brookshire was taken into custody at his home, led out in handcuffs while cameras captured his humiliation. 3 Meridian executives, including the vice president of operations who had authored the infamous cost-benefit memo choosing profits over lives, were arrested at their offices, and Donald Vance, whose threatening visit Sarah had recorded, was arrested at his law firm and charged with witness intimidation, conspiracy, and accessory to attempted murder. The bail hearing 2 days later was a circus of media attention, with prosecutors arguing successfully that the defendants represented flight risks given their resources and the severity of the charges, and the judge agreed, ordering them held without bail pending trial, a decision that sent shockwaves through corporate America as executives who had believed themselves untouchable found themselves in federal detention facing the possibility of life imprisonment. Agent Torres called Sarah personally that evening to tell her that the evidence she had preserved, combined with Frank Morrison's testimony and James Chen's technical analysis, had given them the strongest environmental crimes case the FBI had prosecuted in 2 decades, and that preliminary plea negotiations were already beginning, as lower-level defendants realized the overwhelming nature of the evidence and began looking for ways to reduce their sentences by testifying against their superiors, creating exactly the kind of cascade effect that would ultimately ensure that everyone responsible would face justice. The trials began in federal court 6 months after the arrests, and for 12 weeks they dominated national headlines as the full scope of Meridian Chemicals' crimes was laid bare before judge and jury. Frank Morrison took the stand under federal protection, his testimony detailing the executive-level discussions about neutralizing Catherine Hartley and the systematic bribery of local officials, his voice steady despite visible trembling as he finally unburdened himself of 15 years of guilty silence. James Chen provided expert analysis that demolished the defense's claims of unintentional contamination, his engineering diagrams and cost-benefit calculations proving beyond doubt that every decision had been deliberate and profit-motivated. Sarah testified for 3 days, describing the harassment, the threats against Emma, the midnight break-in, and the fire that had nearly killed her, and when she was cross-examined by defense attorneys trying to paint her as an opportunist, she simply held up the photograph of Mr. Hoppy with the knife through his heart, and asked if they thought a mother would fabricate threats against her child for money. The jury deliberations lasted less than 8 hours, returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and the judge, clearly disgusted by what had been revealed, handed down the maximum sentences allowed by law. Meridian Chemical Corporation was bankrupted by $2 billion in criminal fines and the avalanche of civil lawsuits from families of the dead, with its assets liquidated to fund a federal Superfund cleanup that would take a decade but would finally give 3 towns clean water. Sarah received the federal whistleblower reward of $3 million, but more important to her was watching the first water treatment systems being installed in Harper Creek, knowing that no more children would drink poison. A year later, Sarah stood on the same plot of land where the Hartley mansion had once stood, but the charred ruins were gone, replaced by a modest 2-bedroom home she had designed herself, smaller and safer, with Emma's bedroom facing the mountains and a porch where they could watch the sunset together. The $3 million reward had given them security, but more importantly, it had allowed Sarah to create the Catherine Hartley Environmental Justice Foundation, using $2 million to establish an organization that helped communities across the country fight corporate pollution, providing legal resources, scientific expertise, and the kind of support she had desperately needed during her darkest hours. Emma, now 6 and thriving, played in the yard with a new stuffed rabbit while Sarah knelt in the memorial garden she had planted, placing stones engraved with the names of the 237 people whose deaths had finally been acknowledged and mourned. The local community, once paralyzed by fear and silence, had found its voice, with residents testifying at hearings and demanding accountability from their elected officials. Rebecca Chen had become Sarah's closest friend, and James Chen served on the foundation's board, his guilt transformed into purpose. Sarah had come to this place a year ago, desperate, broke, and alone, seeking nothing more than shelter for her daughter, but she was leaving transformed into something she had never imagined. A mother who had protected her child, a fighter who had taken on corporate monsters and won, and a guardian of truth who would ensure Catherine Hartley's legacy lived on in every community that found the courage to stand up and fight back.